romance, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Hello listeners, this is Charlene. I'm actually doing this special one-off episode without Mike because I wanted to talk about one specific adaptation that's a little bit different because this is relatively unknown. It's only available to watch at the Paley Center for Media in Los Angeles and New York, which are sort of like television museums where they have facilities where you can watch all kinds of old programs in their archives. And as far as I know, this version is the only one that has not been officially released, unfortunately, because I actually really like it and I wanted to share why I love it so much. But while there is no video online of this version, I did happen across an audio recording of it recently, so that's why I thought it would be easier to talk about it on my podcast, because then I can drop in clips to kind of illustrate what's going on. I actually advise that you listen to it on YouTube first because I think you'd really enjoy it, and then you can hear me natter on about it. So I'm talking about the 1961 Jane Eyre that starred Sally Ann Howes and Zachary Scott. It was part of an anthology series called Family Classics in the US. So at that time, there had been a few American hour-long versions of Jane Eyre that were part of these kind of anthology shows where they did all these different stories. So there's a couple out there, one from 1949 and one from 1952 that were both put out by a TV show called Studio One. The first one in 1949 starred Mary Sinclair and Charlton Heston, and then the second in 1952 was Catherine Bard and Kevin McCarthy. And then the other one that seems to be fairly well known floating out there was one for matinee theater in 1957 that starred Joan Elam and Patrick Macnee. Now the Studio One versions, they're pretty basic. I don't personally find them that entertaining. The Charlton Heston obviously is an interesting Rochester. The 1957 one with Patrick Macnee, that's a little bit controversial in some of the ways that they depict the story. It's certainly entertaining. But I really love the 1961 version from Family Classics. I thought that they did such a great job with the story, especially compared with these other 1 hour long American versions where they kind of dived deeper into the romance, and that's always my favorite part. So I thought that if I can get the word out more about this adaptation, maybe someone will release it someday. So again, it's up on YouTube. I'll put the link in the podcast description so everyone can give it a listen. Now, Family Classics was basically live television. It was played live, and this particular episode was even introduced by Joan Fontaine, who played Jane Eyre 18 years before in the 1943 adaptation with Orson Welles. I actually have seen this version because I did go to Paley a few years ago, and again, I really loved it, so I'm so excited that there's this audio and that I can talk about it. It was directed by Mark Daniels, written by Michael Dine, again starred Sally Ann Howes as Jane, Zachary Scott as Rochester, and then Barbara Robbins as Mrs. Fairfax, Angela Thornton as Blanche Ingram, and Laurie Main as St. John Rivers, which compared to the previous 3 American 1 hour episodes, never had a St. John, so that is interesting. So let's get into this adaptation. So the episode begins, as usual, for a short hour-long adaptation. It does completely away with Jane's childhood. She basically tells us that she's an orphan and has no family, so that's it. Don't need to elaborate. She comes to Thornfield.
I, who being an orphan, had never had a home before.
And as Jane arrives at Thornfield, we have Mrs. Fairfax introducing some of the exposition about the house, about Mr. Rochester. Jane asks some good questions. But what I really love about the very beginning is the moody, gothic feeling of the music, which, You heard a little bit of it at the beginning of this episode because I used a little bit of it to begin. And I just think that it's wonderful. It's evocative. Throughout this adaptation, you hear a lot of it, and I think it's so well done. And even if it's a little over the top, it just feels so romantic. So about 5 minutes in, we get introduced to Mr. Rochester in a rather unique way. Because instead of meeting in Hay Lane, he is sitting in the library in the darkness when Jane comes to find a book. And I feel like this is such a unique opening to Jane and Rochester meeting as opposed to them meeting out on Hay Lane. Obviously they didn't have the budget to have some sort of horse situation. So some of the other adaptations kind of play around that too, the 1 hour ones. But this one, just right off the bat, he's already in the house. He just sitting in the dark, and she gets startled because he speaks to her and says, "Miss Eyre."
"You are Jane Eyre, the new governess. Mrs. Fairfax didn't warn me you were speechless."
Who are you, sir?
"Your employer,
Mr. Rochester?
Mr. Rochester." Adele was right. She told me you looked like a frightened rabbit.
Adele has her own way of describing people, sir.
Oh, and how did she describe me?
I don't think it worthwhile to repeat what she said.
She called me a monster, I suppose.
That was not the word she used.
Well, something like it, no doubt. I know that I frighten her. I frighten most people.
And just after that, there's immediate banter and teasing. Part of what I love about this version is the dynamic between Jane and Rochester, because Jane, throughout is not as meek as, again, comparing it to the previous 1 hour versions. She calls out Mr. Rochester sometimes. She feels emboldened to talk back to him. And I think that feels true to the spirit of Jane in the novel, even though that dynamic is kind of rushed because, it takes a little bit of time for Jane to open up. But the audience knows that Jane is engaged and intrigued by Rochester. And having them first meet in the house is a very economical way to move the story forward so that, you encompass the gist of their first conversation as it is in the novel when Rochester finds out more about where Jane comes from and you get the "do you find me handsome" line. So it's all compact. I kind of like how economical this story is in this adaptation. And even though things are rushed, it does feel like they hit all the beats of the novel. So now that we are introduced to our main two couples, I wanted to say that I feel like Sally Ann House is a good Jane. She holds her own, like I said, against Rochester, and a lot of Janes from this early era are just a little too timid, too much like a deer stuck in headlights. And Virginia Bruce from the 1934 adaptation is the exception. She's a little bit more fiery. But Sally Ann, she's really good in this. And Zachary Scott, now I feel like he is the standout in this adaptation. Probably why I like it so much is that, he plays Rochester. He's very acerbic and sharp, but very self-deprecating and bitter. And I think that he gets a lot of Rochester's angst, instead of emphasizing his anger or his moodiness, you get to feel a little bit more sympathy for him because you can see how much pain he is in sometimes. And especially in some of those really kind of over-the-top emotional lines that he delivers, which I hope to showcase a little bit of in this podcast. But overall, I think that the romance and the gothic nature of the story and the eeriness is what this adaptation focuses on. And it's part of why I really like it, because that part of the story in Jane Eyre, it always really appealed to me. And I think that this adaptation kind of hits you over the head with it, but in a good way. And again, because things are so rushed, you do hear Bertha in the background kind of screaming, and the way they explain it is unconvincing. This isn't the first time I think that I've heard Rochester compare Bertha's scream to a wind in a different adaptation. That seems to be a common way to discount the rather alarming noises that Bertha makes. And it also adds to the eeriness of the mystery at Thornfield. It's a little bit extra, but I think it makes sense to play up that aspect for the drama.
Mr. Rochester, did you hear something then?
Only the wind in the chimneys.
So again, time constraints. We move on. We get to the fire in the bedroom, happens almost immediately after their first meeting. And the scene kind of introduces a unique take on the secret at Thornfield because the audience knows that there is someone up there with Grace. So we don't really suspect Grace at all throughout this adaptation. You know that she's helping someone, but you just don't know who that is or why Mr. Rochester is doing it. He does say at this point, I think it's a servant, another servant. So Jane's kind of gives him a pass. But, adds to the mystery. Then you get to a little bit of a romantic moment with Jane and Rochester after the fire. And in previous scenes, Zachary Scott's Rochester, he's gruff and he's teasing, but in this moment, he really shows a little bit more vulnerability. And again, that makes him a lot more sympathetic than I feel like a lot of Rochesters are in even modern adaptations. So that makes him more appealing.
Miss Eyre, you are a young woman of considerable character and courage. If there are things in this house that seem strange, that may alarm you, questions that remain unanswered, I beg you to overlook them. I am counting on you to bring order and sanity into Adele's life. She has great need of them. Will you, for her sake, trust me?
I shouldn't ask you questions at all. But I thought when I heard you tell that woman...
I alone am responsible for what happened. Will you accept that?
If you say so, I accept, sir.
Thank you, Jane Eyre.
If you'll forgive me, I think I'll go up now.
Please, stay a little. I find it hard to sleep before the light comes. Stay by me half an hour.
Of course, sir.
I'll be thankful you are too young to have nightmares. Nightmares of the past that pursue you into a hell from which there is no way back.
I don't believe in hell, sir. We're born to struggle and to endure.
Well, you're not such a little rabbit after all, are you? Joan of Arc come to raise the siege of Thornfield.
I'll do what I can, sir. Whatever I can.
I wonder if you could raise it.
And I haven't really commented on the actual script of the story, which doesn't really follow Charlotte Bronte's text closely. They're not pulling quotes like I do love from other adaptations that, stay closer to the novel when it comes to adapting. But I feel like the text, it turns a lot of subtext to declarations. It's a lot more honest in the way that it portrays the emotions, but it does feel true to the emotions that are in the book. So there's this one quote where Mr. Rochester is kind of comparing Jane to Joan of Arc. Now, this does emphasize the woman needs to save the man she's in love with trope, which, is a little bit in Jane Eyre, but I don't know. I just think it's really romantic, and I like the poignant, pregnant pauses. So another thing that I really love about this adaptation is that we do see Blanche. There's a party. We don't really see anybody else at the party, but the interactions between Rochester, Blanche, and Jane are so good, I think, that, you know that Blanche is not a very nice person, that she's spoiled and pompous, and but then Jane never really gets to speak with her. But in this adaptation, they give them some lines, and Blanche gets introduced, basically starting with the scene in the novel where Jane leaves the party after hearing Mr. Rochester sing, and then Rochester comes after her on the stairs. In this version, Rochester is blatantly asking Jane to come back to the party, even though she doesn't want to, and trying to cajole her into coming, and then Blanche comes out to scold Rochester for leaving while she was singing.
I'd prefer to stay here, if you'd be so kind as to excuse me.
Miss Eyre, you are unsociable.
You have your guests, Mr. Rochester.
You are my guest, too, since I invite you. Have some punch.
I am vexed with you. How could you be so ungallant as to slip away in the middle of my song? Especially when it was a song you chose.
I came out to fetch Miss Eyre, who's been avoiding us.
Oh, that's not true, sir. You sang most beautifully, Miss Ingram. Thank you. You must be the governess. I have that pleasure. I shouldn't think there was much pleasure in being a governess. We always treated ours dreadfully, although I must say most of them deserved it.
I'm sure you were wickedly spoiled as a girl, Blanche.
No, I wasn't. I was charming. Let's see. There was Miss Wilson and Miss Gray and poor Mademoiselle Joubert. She fell in love with my brother's tutor, and that was the end of her.
Why, did he treat her badly?
Oh, no. But governesses aren't supposed to, are they, Miss Eyre? Fall in love, I mean. My mamma thought she would wield an immoral influence, so she packed her off to France. Minus the tutor. What a shame you never completed your education, Miss Ingram.
So even though it's not true to the book, I just love that Jane gets a chance to get back at Blanche in this scene, where she also gets to talk back a little to Blanche and put her in her place. You know, it feels good for the audience. So then Mason arrives soon after, and he has a slight change of character from the book. He's clearly not a very nice man. He wants money from Bertha's wedding fund, and he seems altogether more sinister, which adds to the mystery, which they're doing very well. They're making the story very gothic. Mason is played like a villain, though, and you feel even more sympathy with Rochester because he has this guy as an in-law. Now, there's another change to this story that I think is very interesting. In this adaptation, after Mason is attacked and Mr. Rochester gets Jane to help him, Mr. Rochester tells Jane that there is a, quote, patient in the North Wing that was married to a member of his family, which is an interesting invention. It gives Rochester some credibility to Jane because he gives her a straight answer, even though it's a lie, and it makes Jane less foolish for not trying to find out more about what's going on up there because, of course, why wouldn't she believe Mr. Rochester? It does help to move the story along because then you don't have to focus so much on that mystery. Now you get sucked into the romance and then you get blindsided by the actual truth of the mystery. Another aspect of this adaptation that I really like is that Adele gets a comparatively significant amount of screen time because in the previous hour-long adaptations, I feel like she's more of a means to an end. You know, that she has to take care of a little girl, so they have to drop in an Adele. But in this version, Adele gets a little bit more screen time. She speaks French with Rochester and Jane, and I think it's a nice touch because she's not immediately moved to the background as soon as Rochester arrives on the scene. So this is about halfway through the adaptation now, and we do have another scene with Blanche, and she's catty again, and has a little bit of confrontation with Jane. But then we segue nicely into the proposal where Rochester is again trying to make Jane think that he's interested in Blanche and making her feel emotional, and then switches it up on her and says, "I want to marry you instead." I do particularly like that he calls Blanche a supercilious stick. I thought that fit very well, and then you, I guess, again feel in this proposal that there's a lot of sympathy being put into Rochester's character through the text because the way he expresses himself to Jane, you feel how conflicted he is, and the bitterness, I think, is more pronounced throughout. And with the romance, you do feel they have this strong connection, that Rochester does need Jane. And I really like that this adaptation emphasizes that. Because it might be sappy, but, the romance is a favorite part of the story for me.
How could you say such a cruel thing to me?
Do you find it hard to believe that I've come to love you? Adele wasn't the only one who needed order and sanity. You've given me that, and so much, so wonderfully much more besides.
You can't mean it, and you shouldn't say it. It's wicked to joke about something as serious as marriage.
I do mean it. I don't ask you to love me. Perhaps you know too much about me to love me now. But I need you, Jane. I need you to take my life and make it over. The best and the worst of it, if you will.
There's also a moment after the proposal that you can get a sense of their engagement time, which is always a happy time in the novel. And I thought that there's a little quote that Mr. Rochester says,
"To the devil with superstition, we're immune."
Which is just such a mistake for Mr. Rochester. I mean, why would he say that? He knows what he's doing. He shouldn't have said that. So then now it's their wedding day, and they have a very dramatic interruption of the wedding because Rochester gets pretty angry. I think he might have hit Mr. Mason, which he doesn't do in the novel, but understandable. I guess Mr. Mason is a little bit more annoying in this one. And then he takes everybody to see Grace, and then begins the farewell scene, which is my favorite part of the book, when Jane and Rochester talk and then Jane leaves him. And in this version, I feel like Rochester justifies himself pretty well. We get most of his story about him being young, making a mistake, but I feel like he doesn't really emphasize that he never loved her. You know, he's more angry that she's not a fitting wife and mother to him because of her illness. And saying,
"You've seen her. Do you consider me married to that? Am I to hold that in my arms? Is that to be the mother of my children? You say you love me, yet you condemn me to that."
Don't condemn. Do not condemn you.
But I feel like this scene really takes the emotion of the characters, distills it into an economical description of the full scene where Rochester's despair and Jane's need to respect herself is important. And as I mentioned before, we actually get St. John Rivers in this adaptation, which we have not gotten, not even in the 1934 Virginia Bruce adaptation or the Joan Fontaine one, which is surprising. That one has a Dr. Rivers, not quite the same thing. So we have Mr. Rivers. He mentions his sisters. We don't get Diana and Mary. We don't see them. But this is a different sort of St. John. He's not handsome and austere, and he's not as admirable as you know of the book. So this makes Jane's preference for Rochester a little bit more clear-cut. And because there's not much to like about this St. John. He's a little officious, annoying, he's pretentious. But, you know, he does seem to care for Jane, and obviously he does propose to her, which she does not accept. And another highlight of this adaptation, something else that I think is probably one of the first times that we have seen this done, is there's a flashback to seeing Rochester at Thornfield. So the audience knows what happens before Jane does. I think the next time we see a flashback to Rochester at Thornfield is in the 1983 adaptation miniseries where Timothy Dalton's Rochester is talking to Briggs, the lawyer, trying to find a way to get in touch with Jane. And having that flashback, especially in this version, where you see Mr. Rochester and the house burning and Bertha jumping, it really heightens the suspense and drama because they don't show what happens to Mr. Rochester. And I think it's a good call since there's really no attention given to the river section. It's sort of there, I guess, to inspire Jane to come back to Rochester because after St. John proposes, she thinks, oh, let me just go check on Mr. Rochester. Not really clear what she was expecting or what she thought might happen if she came back and he was still married. But in this section, you don't really get the sense of Jane's strength being away from Mr. Rochester because she says something like,
"Time passed, and with it the pain grew numb. I attended to my academic duties and pretended I was alive."
And it does seem like St. John is more of a comic relief in this story as well, so it's a little jarring after what happens to Bertha and Rochester, but at least they put this in. I have to applaud them for including St. John's proposal.
Well, I'm most flattered that you should think me qualified.
Oh, you are. You are. And naturally, if you agree, we should have to consider certain amendments in our relationship. I hope you understand to what I refer.
No.
Oh. Although we should be carrying out our mission among savage tribes, unblessed by Christian ethics, it would be necessary, purely from a sense of form, you understand, to set an example.
Are you by any chance asking me to marry you?
Well, yes, it had occurred to me that under the circumstances, such an arrangement, purely, you understand, for the sake of convention, might, I had the idea, be generally advisable.
So then we get to what I think is the best part of this adaptation, which is the reunion. Jane comes back, Mrs. Fairfax gives her a little bit about what happened, and Mr. Rochester is blind and sitting in the house still. And the way they play this reunion is fascinating, I think, because there's so much tension in the way Rochester receives Jane because, he's still bitter, more so that he feels he's not worthy of Jane, that she wouldn't want to be with him now that she's blind and maimed. And I just love the way that this scene plays out because Jane also, she's a little bit angry too.
Who is it? Who is standing there?
Me, Jane Eyre.
Oh. What brings you to Thornfield? On holiday, visiting ancient monuments and ruins? Most kind. Most charitable, Miss Eyre.
Oh, my
Does
dear.
it pain you to see me? Your feminine sensibilities are touched, I suppose. Oh, I can imagine all of your Christian virtues marshaled to bestow the most suitable and praiseworthy pity on the disabled.
No, I came because I suddenly felt... I thought I heard you.
You heard of my misfortune? I don't know where you've come from, since you never vouchsafed me an address. Wherever you've been, it's good of you to come. Now that we have dispensed with the amenities, perhaps you'll be good enough to leave.
Is that all you have to say to me?
I am blind. You have seen that. That terminates the purpose of your visit.
You have no cause to use harsh words with me. I did what I thought was right, and you shouldn't vent your bitterness on me. I'm only sorry to see that you met disaster with such poor spirit.
That line about on holiday visiting ancient ruins is probably my favorite. So yeah, Rochester's bitter, but in exasperation, he does admit that Jane was right in everything that she did. And, that's all you really want to hear. Rochester just needed to admit that. And then, I think that kind of smoothed things over, and just the emotions of this reunion, which is not all positive. But eventually, they come to an understanding. They realize how much they love each other. And Rochester accepts Jane coming back to him. Then I think it's just so beautifully done and just so much fun, really, too.
I'm no good to you now.
And I'm no good without you. I'm not going to leave.
Jane, I've missed you so. Where have you been?
Oh, to nowhere and back, it doesn't matter where. Oh, my dearest, my darling. I've come home.
So yeah, I feel that out of the 4 now hour-long American adaptations, this one is just head and shoulders above the rest because it hits the emotional moments better than the other ones. I feel like Sally Ann and Zachary Scott embody the characters better. You get a lot of interesting adaptation choices with St. John and with the mysterious person in the upper room being revealed to be just a patient, and the added dialogue between Blanche and Jane, which is absolutely satisfying. I just really love how they told this story, and I just feel it's a shame that it's not been released officially anywhere. So if someone can make that happen, I'd be so happy. I don't have much additional interesting context for this. I just found a short review from the New York Times when it aired, and this review is not very complimentary, unfortunately. So I'm just going to read it to you. Jane Eyre seen on Family Classics. Sally Ann Howes was a fair and radiant Jane Eyre in a television adaptation of the Charlotte Bronte novel on Channel 2 last night. But this 1-hour telecast in the Family Classics series, emphasizing the melodramatic passages of the story, often reached a ludicrous level. The pyromaniacal frenzy of the mad Bertha Mason was depicted in a style that suggested an old-fashioned horror movie, and in this version of the story, the complacent integrity of the heroine, her love for the volatile Rochester, played by Zachary Scott, and their eventual reunion seemed hollow and unconvincing. Jane Eyre in this production was a corrupted classic. Written by John P. Shanley, April 28, 1961. Well, I can kind of see where it was over the top, melodramatic, very focused on the gothic and the melodrama, but I still think it's such a good adaptation where you feel for the characters. I think there's enough shades drawn upon them where you might be inspired to read the actual story because it was so good. And I have to hand it to Sally Ann Howes and Zachary Scott. I think they were very convincing as Jane and Rochester. So again, if you are interested in listening to this, I think it makes for a pretty good sort of radio or audio adaptation because you don't need to see so much of what's happening, but I highly recommend it. I did say at the beginning of this podcast episode that this is a one-off, as Mike and I are still going to take a hiatus. We're not quite yet ready to come back with the show, but I really appreciate it if you're still sticking with us and you're listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed my enthusiastic breakdown of the 1961 Jane Eyre. I did want to acknowledge that we got a really lovely review on Apple Podcasts from Nightingale Jen. I usually like to read these on the podcast, but this one is really a little bit longer and just really complimentary. I so appreciate it. It really touched me. So Nightingale Jen, thank you. And if anyone else is listening who hasn't left a review for the show, I would really appreciate it. It would mean so much to me if you went on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen and leave a review for us. And also, thank you for sticking with us, and hopefully we'll be back again soon. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.